Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 265. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. On today's show, I have news on Israel, North Korea, and Iraq. A lot of important stuff to cover. First thing I want to mention on today's show is I have several events coming up in the next couple of months. I'll be doing a little bit of traveling, although the first is here in Denver on May 4th. I will be speaking at the Denver Liberty on the Rots event about Ukraine. And then on May 7th, I'm flying to San Antonio and I'll be doing an event with the sponsor of the show, Paloma Verde, PalomaVerdeCBD.com, promo code PEACE. That saves you 20% offers, orders of $75 or more, and it gets the show a kickback. But Paloma Verde is also a company that's run by Carlos Ablar, who hosts the Los Libertinos podcast, and in celebration of the anniversary of his podcast and everything like that, he's hosting an event that I will be attending. So if you'd like to, are in the San Antonio region and come out, get in contact with me, and I will be sure you get all the details to that, and hopefully I can meet up with a few listeners and see you at that event. And then at the end of May, the 26th through the 29th, I'm in Reno for the Libertarian Party convention. I don't have any particular speaking thing there, but I will be at that event. And so if you want to come, meet up with me or something like that, if I have a few listeners who are interested, maybe I'll try to coordinate something for anybody who wants to come and hang out, maybe do a lunch for the show or something like that. And then big news is that in July, I believe the dates are the 13th through the 16th, I will be in Las Vegas for Freedom Fest with the Libertarian Institute crew. So if you'd like to help out the Institute and get us to more things and, a bigger institute and, having multiple members of the Institute going out to Freedom Fest like we have this year, think about heading on over to the Institute and supporting our current fundraiser, libertarianinstitute.org/donate. Of course, the show is hosted at the Libertarian Institute, and that is the best place to share the show. And if you could find everything else, YouTube, Rumble, Odysee for the video version of the show, audio podcast is up everywhere. You could listen to it including on the Libertarian Institute all podcast feeds. So that includes the Scott Horton Show, Liberty Weekly, and a few others. And then you can subscribe to the show on Facebook or Twitter. The Twitter handle is @con_interest. All right, I think that about does it for the plugs and announcements. Let's get into the news. The first article I have here is from the Libertarian Institute by myself and Will Porter on April 15th, U.S. pushing to bring Palestinians into Abraham Accords. The United States is aiming to bring the Palestinian Authority into the Abraham Accords, several diplomats told the Times of Israel. The White House is pushing out the plan as Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett is losing his grip on power. Two Middle Eastern diplomats and an Israeli official cited by the Times commented on the American plans to incorporate the PA into the multinational normalization pact, saying that the practical steps were taken towards that goal during the summit between Arab signatories in the Negev Desert last month. And remember that, you have the Abraham Accords between the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan, and they all signed an agreement with Israel that, provided more cooperation between those governments. It's not that many of these, there are already deep ties, especially between Israel and Bahrain and the UAE, and they became even deeper. It also included the U.S. selling F-35s and other advanced weapons to the UAE, and in response to this, Israel said, well, the U.S. is supposed to guarantee that Israel has the most advanced military capability in the Middle East, and so this actually, in normalizing the relationship between Israel and the UAE, it actually created a situation where the U.S. created an arms race in the Middle East by, we sold planning to sell F-35s to the UAE. That sale might not go through armed drones and things like that. But now Israel wants more advanced systems as well. Washington seeks to include representatives from Jordan and the Palestinian Authority at future gatherings, the Israeli official said, noting that this will likely be easier to pull off when it's not hosted in Israel. Following the Negev summit, the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken spoke positively about the greater Palestinian inclusion, calling on nations normalized in the Abraham Accords and those have long-standing diplomatic relations with Israel to support the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinian people in concrete ways to have a positive impact on daily lives of Palestinians in Israel or in the West Bank and Gaza. The plan would allow the PA to take part in economic deals between Israel and its Arab neighbors after Tel Aviv signed a series of trade agreements after the Abraham Accords with the UAE, Bahrain, Egypt, and Morocco starting in 2020. While Blinken suggested that the Abraham signatories would establish a working group focused on Palestine, that proposal was rejected by the Israeli Foreign Minister Yair Lapid, who said that the Palestinian should be included in 6 other working groups created during the Negev meeting, 2 diplomats told the Time. A dedicated committee would likely face loud opposition from Israel's right-wing parties and could even upend the fragile coalition government, the foreign minister reportedly said. And so if we look at the situation right now in Israel, Naftali Bennett became the prime minister with a very narrow coalition supported by a wide range of different groups. And now that coalition has dwindled to 60 members, which is exactly half of the Israeli Knesset. And at this point, the opposing government would not, or the opposition would not be able to pull off a no confidence vote and remove Bennett from power. However, if he wants to get any legislation passed, you understand, with U.S. politics, how this could be difficult if you don't have a majority in the legislature. And so in the past, when these type of situations has happened in Israel, it's also often led to a situation of increased violence, directed at the Palestinians. And so that's a part of what's going on here. But also with the, government's fragile coalition, it's not really in a place where it feels it can negotiate with the Palestinians because that is not necessarily a political winner in Israel, especially if that's going to involve too many Israeli concessions, which I'm sure would be demanded in any kind of real agreement here. So the PA, the Palestinian Authority, rejects the Abraham Accords and says, it's just a way to cover up for the aggressive Israeli policy and get other Arab states on board against the Palestinians, and called the Negev summit a cover-up for annexation. However, I believe there were some statements from the Palestinians on being incorporated into different things and being, willing to work with different parties here. Now, there's also some, conflicting reports on what the UAE reaction was. Initially, after the summit, they didn't seem to have a positive reaction to this. However, after the announcement came from the U.S., the UAE seemed to get in line and, said that they were on board for this. My sense is that the Palestinian people at large are not going to be supportive of this. The Abraham Accords has allowed the Israel to sell like wine from settlements and other products made in occupied territories in the West Bank to the UAE and other Arab states. And, they see this as a betrayal and a real problem. And so I would guess the Palestinians, even though Mohammed Abbas, who's definitely overstayed his mandate for power, may be a little bit more on board with this because he is typically a little bit more in line with the Western policy, or is less in opposition to Israel as some of the other Palestinians. So There's a little bit of the current political situation going on in some of the U.S. efforts, but now let's get into what's happening in the past week. So last Friday, there were conflicts on the Temple Mount, and I wrote this up with Will Porter at the Libertarian Institute. Israeli police injure Palestinian protesters and journalists on the Temple Mount. Israeli police attacked Palestinian protesters and journalists on the Temple Mount, leaving 152 injured from riot munitions, the Red Crescent reported. Israeli forces began targeting Palestinian protesters at the Al-Aqsa Mosque on Friday. According to the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, PCHR, the police raid was carried out after Palestinians set up wooden barriers at the site and some firecrackers were thrown. Young men prepared wooden roadblocks around the prayer hall in anticipation of a possible Israeli occupation forces raid, the PCHR said. They fired firecrackers towards one of the gates where the Israeli occupation forces were stationed. Immediately, the Israeli forces raided the entire mosque with hundreds of troops. The soldiers started shooting live bullets, tear gas canisters, and stun grenades aggressively and randomly. As a result, dozens of worshippers and gathered civilians were wounded. Writing for the Electronic Intifada, Maureen Claire Murphy has compiled a series of videos showing Israeli forces using stun grenades and clubs, firing non-lethal rounds, and destroying stained glass windows in the prayer hall. She reports that medical teams were prevented from accessing the Temple Mount to treat the wounded. Now, one thing we don't get into and break down because this is just a short news piece, but one important thing going on with the non-lethal rounds like the sponge bullets or the rubber-coated steel bullets is they're non-lethal in certain situations. They can be lethal if you shoot them directly into crowds and things like that. They hit people in the face. People do die from both of these kinds of rounds, but they're used inappropriately by almost all police forces that use them. They're meant to be shot at the ground and then to ricochet and hit people's lower extremities, but they often hit people's upper extremities and even heads. In fact, Al Jazeera reports that a guard was struck in the eye with a rubber bullet. Al Jazeera also reported at least 300 Palestinians were arrested on Friday. And this was last Friday, and some of the Palestinian sources said that number was over 400. And then now, getting to Sunday, Israeli police entered the religious site again on Sunday and faced down Palestinians who set up a stone barrier. Israel claims some threw stones at officers. It says it arrested 6 people for that, and 18 were arrested in total. So, and then here are just a couple other things that have been going on. At the King Faisal Gate, Haaretz published a video showing police beating a man in front of his young son. After the Palestinians were removed, Jewish tourists were allowed to access the site. And if anybody looks at the picture or the article I have here at the Libertarian Institute, the thumbnail picture is of this, where you have a Palestinian man attempting to keep himself and be the body that takes the blows from this Israeli cop as he chases him and his son and swings his club at him. Haaretz also reported 3 journalists were among those beaten by Israeli forces over the weekend. Ala Source had her left arm broken by a club. And this is, you could watch the video of this in the Haaretz article. It's a cheap shot. This lady is just standing there. The cop walks up behind her and swings his club as hard as he can and breaks her arm in one swing with it. And then there was another, a male reporter who was this documented by Haaretz again, where he was on the Temple ground and the Temple Mount grounds. The Israeli police approached him and forced him to the ground and hit him with clubs a few more times after that. The violence at the Temple Mount comes amid heightened tensions across Israel and the occupied territories. A cycle of Palestinian attacks and Israeli raids have claimed several lives in the past month, and the Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett called on residents to arm themselves. On Sunday, Bennett likely rubber-stamped another escalation in violence, declaring Israeli forces had free rein to continue operations to maintain security. So, of course, the very wide picture context of this is Israel is an apartheid state. It occupies Palestinian territory and uses its military to enforce the Israeli military law over them, particularly in the West Bank. The Gaza Strip is, a little enclave of about 2 million people who are cut off from the rest of the world. They're allowed some goods, but generally speaking, Israel keeps it on lockdown. Now, Hamas is the government of Gaza and has a militant force, and as we'll see, they're capable of firing rockets into Israel, but generally speaking, Israel has the military dominance here and the monopoly on violence over all things. So I had discussed this earlier in the week on the Misty Winston show, and then with my Libertarian Institute colleague Keith Knight, saying that the reason I was concerned about the violence on the Temple Mount is, if we look back to last May, that kind of violence escalated and created a situation where there was rocket strikes coming from Gaza, and then Israel bombarding the people of Gaza. And so we had that situation break out a little bit, but it hasn't escalated too much at this point. But this is from myself and Will Porter out on April 20th at the Libertarian Institute. Tensions boil over as IDF strikes Gaza and rockets land in southern Israel. Clashes have erupted between Palestinian militants in Gaza and the Israeli Defense Forces, with the two trading fire on Thursday as tensions reached level not seen since a major outbreak of violence last year. A series of rockets were fired from Gaza starting late on Wednesday night, some of which were intercepted by the Israeli defenses, according to the IDF, while at least one landed in southern Israel. There were no reports of casualties or damage, and no group claimed responsibility for the rockets. I also want to note here that prior to the strikes, actually, Hamas did tell groups not to independently fire rockets. And so it doesn't mean that Hamas wasn't behind this, but it is at least a possibility to consider. Tel Aviv responded by ordering strikes on several sites it said were used by Hamas, sharing footage of the attacks in progress. It's unclear if the strikes resulted in any deaths or injuries. Following the IDF bombing, 4 additional rockets were fired from Gaza into Israel, landing in an open area in the city of Sderot. Again, causing no damage. While no groups claimed responsibility for the rocket strikes, Hamas later said it fired surface-to-air missiles at the Israeli warplanes. And so that will detail that, the flare-up comes as the situation with the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Temple Mount that I just discussed. But we finished here writing, last May, similar clashes at the Al-Aqsa Mosque sparked 11 days of fighting between the IDF and Hamas, which killed more than 130 civilians and left thousands more injured and homeless, mostly in the Gaza Strip. And so this is a horrible thing that I think is going to continue to get worse, and we really should keep our eye on. I know on this show, even almost all the coverage has been focused on the situation in Ukraine, and there's a lot of reasons for that, not just because it's, what the mainstream media says is important news, but this is potential conflict, and really is conflict between the West and Russia, and a real risk that we're fighting a major war here in Eastern Europe. However, there's a lot of other people in the world suffering under the U.S. empire, and the Palestinians are top among them. And so I don't see this de-escalating, but I also don't want to just be an alarmist and predict doom and gloom here. And so keep an eye, especially today. It's Friday. These things tend to get worse as Israeli forces provoke Palestinians during Friday prayers at the Temple Mount. All right, one more story on Israel here, and that is about the spyware firm NSO Group and their spyware Pegasus. Boris Johnson, Catalan politicians, latest victim of NSO Group's Pegasus spyware. Pegasus spyware made by the Israeli firm NSO Group was used to spy on Boris Johnson's office and Catalan independence movements. And I wrote this on April 19th, by the way, for the Libertarian Institute. The NSO Group was founded in 2010 and developed Pegasus a year later. This spyware has the ability to infect devices without users even clicking on a link. Thus far, murdered journalist Jamal Khashoggi, Palestinian human rights groups, and the U.S. State Department were identified as having their phones breached by Pegasus. The U.S. sanctioned NSO Group last year over the proliferation of its cyber warfare product. Citizen Lab, a Canadian research group, has been responsible for identifying several of the phones that were targeted. The New Yorker reports Citizen Lab identified 60 phones of Catalan politicians and leaders that had been targeted. Catalonia is a region of Spain seeking independence. In 2017, a referendum was held and over 90% of the people voted to separate from Madrid, despite the Spanish police seizing ballot boxes and physically assaulting voters. Since the independence referendum, Catalan political leadership has been arrested and targeted with extradition. In addition to the Catalan separatists, the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson's office and the UK Foreign Ministry were targets of Pegasus. It's unclear whether the data was taken, although Citizen Lab believes the data was does believe data was exfiltrated, or what country targeted the UK government and the Catalan leadership. That's an important part of all the Pegasus analysis here, is that we don't know who's, actually responsible for the targeting. Now, the government may, and they're just not passing that along, but that's no public information yet. The Spanish government says that they weren't responsible for spying on the 60 members of the Catalan leadership. It's possible that this is the case. It's also possible that there's some backroom deals going on here where, say, Spain is having the UAE use its access to Pegasus to carry out this espionage, versus having Madrid do it because it's going to be seen as more nefarious, where it gives some deniability or something like that. But at the same time, the relevant or important information could still be passed and communicated. All right, let's move on and talk about North Korea. This from myself at the Libertarian Institute on April 17th. North Korea tests new tactical guided weapon as U.S. South Korea set to begin joint war games. North Korea fired 2 missiles it claims are a new type of tactical guided weapon as the U.S. And South Korea are set to kick off their annual joint war games. Bloomberg reported a message from South Korean military claiming 2 missiles traveled about 60 miles. Joseph Dempsey, a research associate at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, said the new tactical guided weapon outwardly resembles their KN-23 and KN-23 short-range missile. The use of the weapon of the wheeled quad launcher indicates a smaller, lighter, and likely shorter range missile. The North Korean media said the new type of tactical guided weapon system is of great significance in drastically improving the firepower of front-line, long-range artillery units and enhancing the efficiency in the operations of tactical units of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and diversification of their firepower missions. And so this is important because North Korea is saying is that this test is a part of their nuclear program and is giving them at least a new capability, a new method of firing a short-range nuclear-capable missile that could carry potentially like a battlefield-style nuclear weapon. The missile test came days after the 110th birthday of North Korean founder Kim Il-sung. U.S. officials speculated that the Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un could order a nuclear weapons test to commemorate the anniversary. However, the festivities did not even include a military parade. And so while we're seeing this weapons test, it is important to remember that the U.S. government is predicting a far more aggressive North Korean weapons test than actually materialized here. And then the U.S. also said, I believe they thought North Korea may carry out a nuclear weapons test this week. Now, there may be a nuclear weapons test coming from North Korea, but at this point, the U.S. Seems to just be guessing and predicting every week that is going to happen. America and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea have recently engaged in a series of military provocations. North Korea has carried out 13 weapons tests this year. Last week, the U.S. moved the USS Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier strike group near the Korean coast, and I believe I discussed the article I wrote on that on last week's show about the Abraham Lincoln moving into the region. The North Korean missile test came a day before the U.S. and South Korea begin their annual springtime war games. In a separate message on Sunday, Seoul announced that the 9-day military exercises will be limited to simulations because of COVID and other factors. Pyongyang views the military drills as aggressive plans to overthrow the government, and that is essentially what the military drills are about, by the way. They simulate overthrowing the Korean government, like what would happen if Kim Jong-un lost power and how the U.S. would move in and secure all the important sites. All right, a couple stories about Iraq here that are very important. Turkey has launched a new military operation into Iraq. Now, people are saying Turkey invaded Iraq, and this is kind of true, but it did happen a while ago. Turkey has maintained a military base in northern Iraq at the objection of the government in Baghdad for, I gotta say, 5 years now. I don't know the exact date that Turkey started that operation, but it was definitely around the time the fight for Mosul was going on, and so that was 2017. During that time, Turkey has carried out hundreds at this point. A military operation is claimed to killed hundreds of members of the PKK. Some Turkish soldiers have been killed in these operations. It's not exactly clear to what extent Turkey is really fighting the members of the PKK, which are a Turkish Kurdish militant group, some of whom have carried out terrorist attacks in the past. So, there is some legitimacy behind Turkey's claim that they're carrying out, anti-terrorist operations. At the same time, they target a lot of other people, including Yazidis get killed in the crossfire, even Iraqi Kurds or Syrian Kurds. So this isn't clean cut, and of course it is in opposition to Baghdad and a clear violation of Iraq's sovereignty. So just to go through some of that past details a little bit, but this seems to be a real new push in that military operation now, and Turkey claims they've already killed 30 members of the PKK. This next article from Jason Ditz at antiwar.com titled Kurdish Peshmerga denies supporting Turkey in Iraq offensive. In the past, Turkey has faced loud opposition from Iraq to its military offensives in the country, but that no longer seems to be the case. President Erdogan now reports Iraq is supporting the latest offensive announced over the weekend. The Iraqi Foreign Ministry insists this isn't true. The offensive is after the PKK, a banned Turkish Kurdish group, which may be changing things from Iraq's perspective as opposed to the push against Iraq's group on Iraqi soil. The even bigger surprise came from Kurdish MP Mohammed Ali, who reported that Kurdish Peshmerga paramilitary fighters had been sent to support the Kurdish troops against the PKK. Ali is a member of the PKU, said that this was done at behest of the Kurdish Democratic Party. The Peshmerga, however, quickly denied that this was the case, saying that they want Iraqi Kurdish territory to be respected. Iraqi central government officials dismissed the offensive as unilateral Turkish aggression. Though the Iraqi Kurdish regional government has not historically had the best relations with the PKK, it is very unusual to see them lined up against fellow Kurds, more so when they are backing the Erdogan government, which has a reputation for being quite harsh against Turkey's Kurdish minority. I do think there was maybe one case in the past where the Turkish government was able to, or at least tried to get the Peshmerga, or at least one party of the Iraqi Kurds to go along with their operations against the PKK. But I don't know how successful that was or how long it actually lasted. Now, it seems to me, well, my initial reaction was that Turkey is just making this up. Erdogan will say anything to justify his aggressive military actions in Iraq against what he views as an existential threat in the PKK. And him claiming that Peshmerga and the Iraqi government are involved is, just rhetoric. Now, that may be the case even with this net story, but I don't know, this does make me somewhat skeptical. And this, again, Jason Ditz at antiwar.com. On Thursday, Turkey summoned the Iraqi chargé d'affaires to discuss the matter of denying that Turkey has permission to invade Iraq. And so that Turkey is, summoning the Iraqi ambassador over this is somewhat interesting, because it seems like something unlikely to happen if Turkey was just making up the fact that they had got permission for the invasion. Now, Turkey may have, gone to the wrong official or something like that, found somebody very official, favorable to make the statement, paid a bribe, got somebody to make the statement. It wasn't actually true, and so they're getting burned a little bit, but it's worth paying attention to. And so, anyways, I want to bring up this, this Turkish operation in Iraq because it potentially has the back end of the Iraqi government. That's interesting. I think there's a lot of people, even in the independent media circle, that are maybe making a little bit too much of this, saying it's like, well, why isn't the mainstream media paying attention to this? And, well, Turkey's been carrying out operations in Iraq for a long time. Although, there was a civil war going on in Ukraine for a long time too, so it's not a completely ridiculous comparison, but at the same time, I don't think it really lines up, and I don't think Turkey's actually planning on seizing any Iraqi territory, at least from anything I've seen at this point. Now, before I wrap up, I am going to talk about Afghanistan a little bit. This article from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Afghan officials say scores of civilians killed in Pakistan's airstrike on Afghanistan. Afghanistan's officials say that Pakistan launched airstrikes on targets in the eastern provinces of Kunduz and Kandahar early Sunday morning. According to officials, at least 47 civilians were killed in the strikes. And then here we go from the this is an Afghan, Taliban government official. 41 civilians, mainly women and children, were killed and 22 others were wounded in the airstrikes by Pakistani forces near the Durand line in the Kunduz province. The Durand line is the Pakistan-Afghan border. In Kundahar, Afghan officials say 6 people were killed. Afghan's Tolo news service shared images of children's bodies that were said to be killed in the attacks and reported the strikes hit residential areas. Pakistan hasn't commented on the attacks yet, but Islamabad's foreign ministry says Sunday and called on the Pakistan-led government in Kabul to take action against terrorists that are carrying out cross-border attacks in Pakistan. I have mentioned that these cross-border attacks and the fact that the Tehrik-e-Taliban, the Pakistani Taliban, sometimes use the acronym TTP, was, at one point driven across the Pakistan border into Afghanistan, where they became the Islamic State Khorasan faction. But with the Taliban taking back over, for whatever reason, they have either maybe gotten stronger in Afghanistan. Maybe the Taliban are actually pushing back on them more, maybe carrying out more attacks on their leadership or something like that. But in the past several months, at least, there have been more conflict between the Trinki Taliban and the Pakistani government. And as I have been talking about on this show for a while, the ceasefire that had existed between the Pakistani government and the Trinki Taliban had broke down. Also, there's this new BLA group that I don't know a lot about that's carried out a few attacks against Pakistani military bases. And so that was going on. Of course, last week, Imran Khan, the Pakistani prime minister, was removed in a no confidence vote, and this strike came just days after that. And so I have to think that at the very least that had something to do with it, that maybe for whatever reason Imran Khan was skeptical of carrying out these strikes and the new government was maybe more for it. There's some speculation that the U.S. pressured Pakistan to put this new government in charge. And of course, most people, as all the analysis right now is lined up on the Ukraine issue, and this is even the point that Imran Khan made when he was removed from power, that was over his unwillingness to pick a side in the U.S. new Cold War against Russia. However, it could also be in part the Afghan issue that is causing some of everything that's happening here. If the U.S. is, having, wants some pressure, maybe they want the Pakistani military to carry out these strikes in Afghanistan. That way the U.S. government doesn't have to do it. And, another government's killing the civilians. So, there's a lot here, and I don't know everything about the Pakistan government, in their politics and why they made the decisions that they do. So that's a little bit of speculation on my part. But whenever a government changes hands and then the couple days later you have airstrikes carried out in a new country, you got to be suspicious as the change of leadership that is causing that. Now, let's see. I'm trying to think if there's anything else on these particular strikes that I have. I really don't. The claims are coming from the Taliban at this point, so it could have been less civilians than they claim. Could have even been more militants could have died than the Taliban are saying too. Just trying to make the Pakistan government look bad. I'm not sure. In some respect, the Pakistani government has been supportive of the Taliban as they fought against the United States, and so I guess I wouldn't assume that the Taliban would be directly at odds with the Pakistani government, but there's a lot of politics playing out here that I don't quite understand. So a lot more, I got more questions than answers for you on that. Now, the Islamic State then carried out a series of bombings across Afghanistan, killing at least 20 people. I haven't yet gotten a firm number on that. Targeting religious sites, Shia religious sites, including in Kabul, and I believe over 20 people have died, including some children. So this is pretty awful. Now that there's some violence going on in Afghanistan, or an increasing violence going on in Afghanistan, and it's not just the U.S. sanctions that are starving people to death. So this is a bad situation for the people of Afghanistan. That's where I'm going to wrap up the show for today, everyone. I hope you're enjoying this show. Any feedback you got, please let me know. If you got good feedback, leave a rating and review somewhere for the show. Comment section, anywhere. Retweet the show, share the show, anything you could do to get it out there to more people. We are wrapping up our fund drive at the Libertarian Institute. We are almost to our goal, and we do have matching funds the rest of the way. So if you want to help us to get there and hear me stop talking about our fundraiser, head on over to the Libertarian Institute. Your $100 becomes $200 instantly when you donate, so it's an absolutely great deal to do that right now, and we offer fantastic kit bags. So, even if you got yourself a copy of Enough Already or Fool's Errand, get yourself another one, donate it to the library, give it to somebody and be like, hey, check out this great book. And again, if you're in Denver, San Antonio, Reno, Las Vegas, or attending any of these events like Carlos's Los Libertinos anniversary or the LP convention, Freedom Fest, I will be there, and look forward to meeting some listeners and things like that. Anyways, thanks for listening to the show, and I'll be back with more next week.